Everyone pays homage to the cult of the self, where everyone is their own priest. A talking point I've seen flying around the internet is that society today feels empty. The funny thing is, this has been shouted from all across the political spectrum. It seems that almost everyone can agree we have some crisis of meaning on our hands across the modern world. Oftentimes, when people who normally want nothing more than to give one another a hard slap come to agree on something, there is some good philosophy to be had. And one interesting take on the current collective sense of meaninglessness comes from Byung-Chul Han. In his book, The Disappearance of Ritual, he makes a pointed critique of the way many of our current societies are structured, without invoking excessive nostalgia for the past. He observes that the habit of sacrificing everything for the sake of maximizing efficiency and production has robbed us of a richer view on reality, and today we will unpick this criticism. Get ready to learn the downsides of too much productivity, what the meaning of Christmas has to do with existentialism, and whether there is something to be said for the irrational and the silly. Bear in mind, I'll be unable to cover every aspect of Han's thought here, and also that the question, why does so much today seem meaningless, is such a complex and multifaceted one that any succinct answer to it will inevitably leave a lot out. Additionally, while I won't have time to look at in-depth critiques of Han's views here, it is important to remain critical when absorbing his ideas. But without further ado, let's crack on, starting with the very idea of a ritual. 1. Rituals and their relevance. Much of Han's argument rests on the idea that we have slowly given up rituals for the sake of more efficiency and productivity. So let's start by defining what he means by ritual and the broad reason he thinks they have been eroded away. The idea of a ritual is actually pretty hard to pin down. In terms of identification, it is very much you know it when you see it. A Catholic Mass is a clear example of a ritual, as is an initiation ceremony. Many communities around the world have formalized coming-of-age rituals, where you leave behind your childhood and become a fully fledged member of that society, taking on all of the associated responsibilities of an adult in that culture. So rather than giving necessary and sufficient conditions, there are instead a few key characteristics Han identifies rituals as having throughout his essays. It is not that all rituals contain all of these, but rather that together they describe a sort of family resemblance between rituals, to borrow a term from Wittgenstein. First, Han says that rituals often involve a temporary suspension of the ego. This is sort of an obscure sentence, but it points to a pretty intuitive idea. Rituals often contain rules that are strictly followed, regardless of how any individual feels about them. All around the world, the Catholic Latin Mass is performed in pretty much the exact same way, and the parishioners broadly know what they should do. They sit, they stand, they hear certain passages read, they kneel, and they receive the wafer and wine that form the Eucharist. There is not much question of any individual attendant putting a personal spin on it. It is just followed. On the one hand, this aspect of ritual has been criticized rather heavily. It has been seen as stifling individual expression. While Han recognizes this critique, and certainly doesn't want to idolize every ritual, he also thinks this is one of ritual's greatest strengths. Though Sartre was an enormous fan of individual authenticity, he also thought being an autonomous agent can be an awful lot of pressure. It is easy to feel the crushing weight of responsibility on our shoulders to be free individuals making our own ways in the world. For Han, the ritual is a brief opportunity to take that burden off and allow ourselves to be absorbed in a collective. It is a bit similar to Nietzsche's idea that egos would be suspended within certain Dionysian rituals. The line between us and other people is temporarily blurred because we are all doing the same thing and forgetting ourselves for a moment. Secondly, Han thinks that rituals are tools of recognition. Again, this is a pretty nuanced concept that nonetheless has a real intuitive feel to it. When we encounter a ritual that's familiar to us, it is almost like seeing an old friend. We feel comfortable in its presence, and since we've repeated it before, it gives us a sense of friendliness or grounding. When I was very little, I lived in a small village, and every year almost every resident used to gather by the village hall on Christmas Eve to spend an hour or so singing carols around a big bonfire before going into the village hall for some mince pies, some mulled wine, and a cup of tea. I still remember the curious feeling of homeliness that ritual brought with it. I would look forward to it every year, and in a weird way, it made me feel welcome in the community I lived in. This is partly what Han means when he compares the effect rituals have on our lives to making a home out of a house. It is a way of dressing up a given moment in time with a repetitive exercise that builds layers of meaning as it gathers momentum. The first time I attended the carol singing, it was a new ritual to me, but the next time I had all the memories of the first time to grant it additional meaning. And by the third, it truly felt like something special. Those few hours on Christmas Eve felt like they were glittering because they had been made sacred by all of this memory and meaning. Thirdly, Hahn thinks that rituals imbue certain situations with a sense of value that goes well beyond our everyday economic ideas about efficiency or production. Rituals bring with them a sense of play because they are by nature divorced from the kind of serious business of making money or producing commodities. A group of people have decided that a given situation is special or sacred separate from any profit motivation. Again, let's take the Catholic Mass. Significance is granted to the whole thing by placing it in a worship context. It is by its very nature leaving behind the notions of efficiency or getting it done quickly. There may be entire pieces of music sung in order to lend reverence to the moment and to extend it. It is anti-efficient. It is luxurious with time. For Hahn, a ritual does not say, this is a great way to spend some time while you rest to be productive the next day. It rather says, I am the point. I am meaningful, separate from any concern about productivity or money. For Hahn, this reminds us to look outside the habits of producing more stuff or making more money or devoting ourselves to work, and instead carves out a space for us to value other things. In this way, it is almost a small act of rebellion against the dominant way of valuing our time in accordance with the market. Here, time is not given meaning by what we have to show for it, but the time itself is granted significance. To riff on another philosopher, it is the difference between aiming to get a boulder to the top of the hill and simply smiling while you're pushing it. It's primarily the last of these that Hahn thinks has made us devalue rituals in the modern age. For him, the dominant way of measuring value in the world has become market value. Essentially, this means that we value things primarily for how much money they make or how much they produce. This is subtly different from the kind of critiques other philosophers have made of our current economic organizing system. Hahn is not so much talking about the exploitation of one economic class by another, but rather a shift in values that is encouraging us all to place work and productivity at the top of our priorities, and that fails to recognize other forms of value that might make for a more rounded or fulfilling life. There are many ways that Hahn thinks the modern world demeans rituals, and we'll be looking at some of them later. But a lot of them stem from the idea that rituals are pointless or inefficient. The religious idea of the Sabbath is a very good example. This is a sacred day of rest, and in many ways used to be treated as such, with most businesses grinding to a halt on designated Sabbath days. But now, Sabbaths have largely fallen out of fashion, at least in Europe. Most businesses just run usual hours on Sabbaths in order to make more profit. There is nothing inherently wrong with these individual decisions, but Hahn suggests trends like this are part of a general sacrifice of rituals for the sake of market value. So, that is the broad outline of what Hahn thinks a ritual is and how he thinks they've been under attack. But so what? If these rituals truly are inefficient, isn't it only right they should be left in the past? Well, the trouble is that all of those functions we said rituals fulfilled are now going underserved. And that can have some pretty dire consequences. Starting with increased isolation. If you want to help me make more videos like this, then please consider becoming one of my very kind patrons. You'll help me and gain access to occasional exclusive content. The link is in the description. 2. Communities and togetherness. One of the great crises of the modern world is loneliness. So much so that the World Health Organization has actually declared it one. Young people are reporting being lonelier than ever before, and the number of close friends people have has dropped precipitously since the 1990s. Additionally, many observe a nebulously defined erosion of community over the past century. It's difficult to say exactly what this is, but if you talk to anyone over the age of 60, they tend to mention how much more people knew one another in the past, how people spoke to their neighbors, and how they perceived a generally higher degree of public trust. This may just be nostalgia on their part, but I'm inclined to give it some credit given just how ubiquitous this particular observation seems to be. Given this crisis, one thing is clear. We should be paying very careful attention to the sorts of things that build communities up and the sorts that tear them down. For Hahn, rituals are an invaluable tool in the art of forging close-knit communities. When a group of people are all doing the same thing at the same time, they can begin to identify with one another. Their egos melt away, and they feel as if they're part of something larger than themselves. If anyone here ever has sung in a choir or played in an orchestra, Hahn seems to describe a similar feeling to that. We temporarily forget ourselves and prioritize the people around us over whatever whims we have at that moment. In group music making, every participant essentially sacrifices their own will for the sake of making a beautiful piece come to life. This is the effect we talked about in the previous section. Rituals make our own egos seem far less significant from a first-person perspective. But here, it is not just about forgetting us, it is about remembering others. Hahn discusses how when we lose sight of ourselves, we become much more open to looking outwards towards other people, but also to something higher or greater than any one of us. In a religious context, this might be a deity, but in a secular one, it might just be the shared idea of a community. One of the rituals we have that is still alive and well is marriage, and in a marriage ceremony, the two participants not only pledge themselves to one another, but also to the higher idea of marriage. They are often thought to form one unit that is greater than simply the two of them put together, and they both live in service not just to one another, but also this other thing. The point is that some community is formed, even if it's just two people, and this allows for bonds of trust to be built. There's a sense that everyone involved has something in common, and that they are, very loosely, working towards a shared goal. It is not that communities could never be formed without rituals, but rather that they can be fantastic aids in this. They form part of the patchwork of shared ideas, practices, and touchstones that creates a sense of usness. If rituals make a place or time homely, then they also make a shared home with the other participants. Hahn suggests that without these rituals, it is surprisingly easy to become self-absorbed. By this, he does not mean that we will think too highly of ourselves, but rather that we will sort of forget other people and other things because we are too wrapped up in us and our image. I bet most of us have seen this sort of thing in action. Someone makes themselves miserable because they cannot stop having thoughts about them and their own ego. They might worry about whether people are watching them or making fun of them, or whether they're going to do well out of life, or whether they're ugly or tall enough or good enough. It's not that this is immoral, it's just profoundly unpleasant. One of the joys of a ritual is that we temporarily do not worry about any of these questions and instead allow ourselves to be swept up by the moment, all while maintaining our individuality before and after. It is similar to the observation by C.S. Lewis that we humans are much happier not when we are thinking highly about ourselves, but rather when we are not thinking of ourselves at all, and rather focusing on other people or other things, anything outside of us. Hahn points out that our current value system really prizes individuality. We are taught to be independent from one another, to embrace our own authenticity and carve a unique path through life. This has many strengths to it. It allows for a large amount of individual variation and does stoke a sense of real independence in people. However, Hahn also wants to point out the downsides of this approach. It works against the sort of ego forgetting that allows us to bond together during rituals, to form one body and act as one. For Hahn, this all follows quite naturally from an increasing emphasis on individual achievement and performance. If we are looked down on for associating with communities and instead constantly asked what we individually have done and achieved, then ritual ends up running counter to the very thing we're encouraged to do. If we're not careful, this atomization may condemn us to loneliness. It's important to note here that Hahn is not saying the past was better in every way. In a lot of cultural criticism, we can have a knee-jerk reaction to something wrong with the present by idolizing the past, but Hahn keeps his focus firmly on the here and now. And he warns us that the misery brought on by constant self-concern and the crushing expectations of bare individual achievement will only get worse over time if we do not find ways of reconnecting through communities bonded together, potentially, with shared rituals. These might be formal rituals like church services, but they might also simply be shared, revered practices. As long as it serves the function of making us at home in the world and with others, then it would go some way to allaying Hahn's worries. On the other hand, we certainly don't want to lose sight of the individual entirely. I don't know about you, but I would not wish to become totally ruled by ritual either. It seems to me that there is a balance to strike here, and an ongoing question of where exactly that balance is. However, this is also only one aspect of Hahn's argument. Just as a lack of ritual can tear people apart and make them feel like they have nothing in common, it can also turn the world into a bleak and uninteresting place. And this is just our next point. 3. Blank maps and empty storybooks. A common theme in a whole host of philosophy is that the human hunger for meaning is heavily related to our search for narrative. The French philosopher Paul Ricoeur used to say that a huge amount of our understanding was caught up in narrative, especially our understanding of ourselves. He probably has the neatest exposition of this view, but we see its precursors long before him. Friedrich Nietzsche talked about how people could overcome nihilism by making themselves into a work of art and giving life style. This is sometimes interpreted to mean we would lend ourselves a meaningful narrative to our own lives, one that would make our suffering worthwhile. Beyond this, we can often see how existential crises mirror the frustration of narrative arcs. In Ecclesiastes, King Solomon goes through a deep despair at the meaninglessness of life, and he focuses on cycles and a lack of satisfying closure. You wake up, you go to sleep, you wake up again, you go home, you go to work, you go back to home, and over again until you die at no particularly significant moment. In Albert Camus' The Myth of Sisyphus, the cycle of rolling a boulder up a hill and watching it fall back down is partly distressing because it flies in the face of any sort of conclusion and thus a resolution to a narrative. All through existential philosophy, we see the concept of meaning often closely aligned with narrative descriptors, and a lack of meaning associated with sequences that defy narrativization. When someone asks, "What is it all for?" they seem to be requesting a resolution, a point in life where they can set down their flag and say, this is what it has been for, at least up to this point. And this is a job Hahn thinks rituals are very well placed to do. Another aspect of making a portion of time homely is that it becomes infused with a sense of meaning. There is nothing physical to distinguish a house from a home, but it means something for the occupants, and the same goes with temporal rituals. Classically, the coming-of-age ritual is meant to mark the end of childhood and the start of adulthood. It answers the question, what has it all been for, by saying, until now, it's been about becoming an adult. It is an event infused with narrative, and as a result, it slightly disrupts Solomon's observation about the endless cycle of waking up and going to sleep. If someone goes through this sort of ritual, there was a day when they woke up as a child and they went to sleep as an adult. There was difference, there was progression. Of course, we can wonder why we need this sort of benchmarking in our lives. Why can we not perform a little personal ritual and be done with it? But for Hahn, this would be much less effective. Part of why rituals are such brilliant ways of narrativizing time is because everyone is in on the construction, and that makes it feel more real. Again, to use marriage as an example, if I told you last week my partner and I said some words in a building, that means nothing to anyone. Even if we privately thought of it as akin to a marriage, it is not going to have that sense of meaningfulness that comes with the recognition of a collective. If I instead told people that I got married last week, they would immediately know what that meant and how it marks a turning point in my life. To clarify, I didn't get married last week, it's just a hypothetical. The idea is that Hahn wants us to be able to make sense of time without it all blurring into one. Rituals, even oft-repeated rituals, can add a sense of differentiation to the days. Here, Hahn draws the distinction between ritual and routine. Because rituals are imbued with this sense of significance, they are likely to draw our total attention. Our total attention then, interestingly, reinforces the sense of significance. It becomes a kind of virtuous cycle. As a result, it stops life becoming one amorphous background blur and marks off certain time periods. For Hahn, this is one function of a religious weekly observance. It means there is a bit of narrative closure in every week. By contrast, routine is just the stuff we happen to do every day, divorced from any kind of symbolic significance. I brush my teeth multiple times a day as a matter of routine, but it does not stand for anything. It just does what it says on the tin. All of this helps make life seem much less like it's just the same thing repeating forever. It's a bit like having chapter headings. It grants existence a sense that it's going towards something, and that in turn makes it seem that bit more meaningful. This also ties back to what we were saying in the last section about community bonding. If rituals help lend life a sense of narrative, then sharing rituals with a community lends a sense of shared narrative. This symbolic depth stands in contrast to what Hahn calls bare life. This is where we deliberately strip any meaning or symbolism away from the world and care only for material or consumable things. It puts everything on the same level as me brushing my teeth. Hahn compares this to the difference between seduction and an empty amorous encounter. In the first case, Hahn charts a whole series of narrative steps and suggests that would make it seem more meaningful, whereas in the second there is nothing particularly to hang the meaning on. There is no narrative arc involving tension and release and roles and shared play, but instead there is a mere event, to use Hahn's terminology. It is robbed of any ritual or symbolic meaning and is instead purely a means to some further end. This is a bit tricky to cognitively understand or explain, but you might get a better idea if you just reflect on the rituals that have existed in your own life. How do they feel? Do they lend a sense of narrative to your life? Do they imbue an otherwise ordinary event with symbolic or greater meaning? According to Hahn, in an effective ritual, the answer should be yes. I like how this puts a spin on other philosophies of meaning creation out there. When someone like Jean-Paul Sartre or Simone de Beauvoir ask us to craft our own meaning through individual authenticity and commitment to our values, that is one perspective on what will add that ineffable meaningfulness to life. The aim is partly to re-enchant existence using a particular methodology. To this extent, those 20th century existentialists are putting forward an empirical hypothesis. They are suggesting that if we do prioritize these things, then that will make life seem full and dispense with the feeling that it is all for nothing. But Hahn suggests another way. Given his own religious background, he looks outwards towards ceremony and community to suggest that meaning is found in shared ritual experiences with others. Rather than finding meaning in the self, he wants us to look out for it. It is not that our own atomized approach gives life meaning, but rather that we can make the experience of time and life seem meaningful with particular practices. Regardless of what you think, it is a wonderful counterpoint to the more individualistic focus of some of these existential philosophies. Put a pin in this point, as we'll be revisiting it in the next section. And again, it is the focus on production and efficiency which deprioritizes this kind of ritual. If you are attempting to maximize productivity and profit, then any sort of independent narrative creation does not seem to make sense. It basically appears like a waste of time. In fact, many of the properties of popular rituals run directly counter to values like efficiency. The slow reverence with which the host is elevated and consecrated is deliberately wasteful with time. A wedding is often deliberately wasteful with money. Coming-of-age ceremonies are often wasteful with both. This is partly what Hahn means when he says rituals allow for luxury. But at the same time, this makes it a prime target for being slowly forgotten as the need for greater productivity and efficiency take over. But as we have fewer and fewer rituals, life seems less and less remarkable. The multi-layered texture of an existence full of different meaningful narratives is sandpapered down into a featureless landscape, and joy is sacrificed for the sake of performance. But lastly, I want to take a little moment to reflect on the very concept of meaning, and pose a challenge to some of the most famous philosophers in history. 4. The Terror of Reasonability. This is hardly the most controversial take in the world, but I am an enormous fan of the concepts of reason and rationality. During my undergrad, I became obsessed with symbolic logic, and then in my master's, I used to stay up all night playing around with different logical systems and seeing what they could do. I can only assume this is how every other university student spends a Saturday night as well. But recently, I've been reading a series of criticisms of rationality for approaching certain issues, specifically those about meaning and existential problems. A classic rationalist way of approaching the problem of life's meaning is outlined by Albert Camus, where he says that when we learn that there is no inherent meaning to life, attempting to create it or just believe in it is tantamount to abandoning all of your philosophical principles. He even calls it philosophical suicide. This is the basis for his absurdism. He thought that moving past the need for meaning was then the only rational route forward. But in many ways, Camus' commitment to rationality in existential matters is pretty esoteric. Friedrich Nietzsche used to say that life's meaning or lack thereof is not so much rational or irrational, but stands outside rationality. This is because he primarily conceives of life's meaningfulness not as a cognitive judgment about life, but rather a sort of feeling around existence. For him, the person who questions whether life is meaningful in and of itself is approaching the matter backwards. A feeling of meaning is instead the reward someone gets for having a strong and organized will. Here, the sense of fullness falls out of some prior condition. It is not that life's meaning is asserted, but it is rather an emergent property of other things. This is also a theme throughout Kierkegaard's philosophy, which often prioritizes leaps of faith in order to bridge the gap between the crushing amount of things we could do and the few things that we will actually be able to do. This is also how he solves existential issues, where he finds God via the use of a committed faith. For him, the question of life's meaning can only be put to rest through a temporary irrationality. Perhaps the apotheosis of this approach is embodied in the criminally underrated Russian philosopher Lev Shestov, who saw the origin of many existential issues in the dogged commitment to rationality in our approach to the question of life's meaning. He thought that existential despair often emerges from the idea that we must have a reasonable justification for being. He viewed the rationality constraint as perfectly acceptable when we're conducting many forms of inquiry, but that it misapprehends the nature of an existential issue. For Hahn, this idea of rationality is co-opted by the prioritization of market value to place things which increase production as rational, and things which do not as a waste of time or otherwise frivolous. But Hahn thinks this too misunderstands the way to approach existential issues. Sure, rituals often seem like they have no point from the outside, but that is because their purpose can only be understood from within. It is a bit like how foreign language might appear as meaningless scribbles to someone who does not speak it, but it could be beautiful poetry to anyone that does. The demand that rituals be answerable to market forces or just universal rationality robs them of their ability to properly do their job. It's like judging a fish by its ability to climb a tree. Sure, they are unproductive and inefficient, but their task is not to be either of those things. Their job is to bring communities together, imbue life with meaning, and create an understandable shape to time, and this might involve doing something that seems absurd from the outside. So, what can we take from this? Well, Hahn would probably want us to first become conscious of the primacy of productivity in our map of value. Many of us are already partially aware of this. We're sometimes reminded of it when we are told to establish a work-life balance or avoid burnout. But are we surprised that many of us struggle with this, considering that we often do not have alternative value schemes to replace the one around productivity and efficiency? In contrast to this, Hahn encourages us to adopt some aspects of a ritualistic approach to life, even though it might seem totally irrational from the outside. Here, we are encouraged to look outside the totalizing force of market value and ask how we can imbue moments of our life with meaning, using his observations about rituals to do so. This is not an imposition to return to particular historical rituals, nor is it just a trite suggestion to value other things, because Hahn does not pretend that it is nearly that simple. If we look at how he thinks rituals grant meaning, it's actually a rather involved process. It includes multiple people gathering at the same time, partaking in the same narrative, and making aspects of time and life feel like home. It is a much clearer, practical idea of meaning creation than that given to us by many other philosophers. It is one of the most detailed philosophies of meaning construction out there, and, in some ways, I think it is one of the most hopeful. As we said earlier, it provides a less individualist way of approaching existential philosophy. Much of the late 19th and 20th century views on finding meaning are incredibly individual. They're about discovering your personal authenticity and crafting your own values separate from anyone else. The Übermensch is a pretty individual figure, as is the concept of someone who is totally personally authentic. Crafting rituals together and adopting a slightly more ritualistic approach to life is difficult and may rub up against our individualistic and rationalistic sensitivities. We may feel silly or like we're becoming part of the herd. But if Hahn is right, then reintroducing a bit of ritual into our lives may serve as a small safe haven from the values of production and efficiency. It can allow us to lend meaning to the process of life itself, rather than sublimating it all to the end goal of numbers on balance sheets. It can bring us closer together with others, build communities, and differentiate one moment of time from the next. It can give not just one answer to what is it all for, but several successive answers over the course of an entire existence. To employ a much abused word, it gives a sort of holistic form of existential philosophy, where the solutions are not just found individually or rationally or introspectively, but by creation, action, and, most importantly, play. At the very least, it sounds like it is worth some firm consideration. But if you would like to learn more about Hahn's overall philosophy, then click here to look at my analysis of his landmark essay, The Burnout Society. I hope you enjoyed this video and have a wonderful day.